Good afternoon, everybody. Bobby Cleveland, Executive Director of Oklahoma Correction Professionals, along with our special guest today with Innocent Project. We got Andrea Miller, and we have JJ Humphrey. And JJ has
That's special.
has agreed that he would let Andrea speak today.
I never agreed to that, Bob. I don't know about that.
Well, Andrea, tell us a little bit. We don't have the hour and it goes by quick. When we're looking at Innocent Project, a lot of people I know about it, and a lot of people I know don't know about it. So tell us about Innocent Project.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. Well, I'll start with saying that most people are probably familiar with the name the Innocence Project, but that actually refers to the project in New York that was originally started by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. Most people in the state of Oklahoma have not heard of the Oklahoma Innocence Project, which is the project that I work in. The Oklahoma Innocence Project is a legal clinic at Oklahoma City University School of Law. We investigate and litigate cases of people who are factually innocent of the crimes that they have been convicted and incarcerated for. So we are a separate project than the Innocence Project, but like every other entity that has the name Innocence Project in it, we are all part of a loosely connected network of innocence projects that help us kind of stay up to date on important developments in the law or in forensic evidence, and those sorts of things related to trying to help people who have been wrongfully convicted of the crime that they are serving time for.
How many how many people would you estimate, on percentage wise, are incarcerated today, just in Oklahoma, that could possibly be innocent?
I've seen numbers that say anywhere up to 10 or 15%. We believe that it's probably more accurately around 4 or 5%, which might not sound like very many people. But when you break that down, if there are currently 27,000 people in DOC, and I think that's approximately correct right now, then you're talking about over 1,300 people in the system who are serving time for a crime they did not commit.
And then how do you get a case?
So our process is that we have to receive a letter directly from an inmate. A lot of times people will continue to tell their supporters and their family and their loved ones that, they aren't guilty, but it's another step to actually write a letter to the Oklahoma Innocence Project and say, I'm innocent and I need help. But that's all the letter has to say. Usually the letters are much longer than that, much more detail, and give us a good snapshot of what happened in the case. But at the very least, the inmate has to write us directly and say, I am innocent and I need help. And what that does is that then prompts us to send a questionnaire. And we send a 20-page questionnaire that asks all sorts of questions about their case and their attorneys and the prosecutors on the case and what kind of evidence was introduced against them. It's a pretty lengthy questionnaire. So somebody has to be pretty motivated to spend that much time filling out a 20-page questionnaire about their case. But once they send that back to us, then we open a file and they go into our backlog, and we have a fairly substantial backlog at any given moment. But then it will be vetted to determine if it meets our basic case criteria. And if it does, then it will just go in line for assignment. And eventually I will pick it up and assign it to a student to start working on and start investigating.
So there's no charge to that inmate.
We are and this is something that I really want people to understand. We are a 100% pro bono, meaning free, legal service organization. And what that means is all the costs of investigating, all the costs of any experts that are needed, the costs of actually getting back into court, the cost of the attorneys who represent the inmate are all entirely free. We will never ask for money from an inmate, and we will never ask for money from their family. And I want people to understand that, because there are people who go into DOC and tell people they are affiliated with the Innocence Project, and then ask them for a whole lot of money, and then most of the time end up messing up the case to the point that we would never be able to get back into it at that point, even if it's a righteous case. So yes, we are completely pro bono. We never charge anybody for anything.
Now you have detectives.
We work with 5 or 6 private investigators around the state. Since we handle cases in all 77 counties, we have kind of a broad area.
So they work also pro bono.
They work. We pay them for their time, although they give us what I like to refer to as the public defender rate. So they give us a reduced rate than what they would charge if we're just hiring them as private investigators. But we have a great bunch of investigators who are extremely dedicated and really understand what it is we're trying to do and what it is we have to find in order to get back into court. And I think they really like working with us, because the way I approach a case is, if the wrong person was convicted, then the right person is out there. And not that we have to prove exactly who committed the crime, but we investigate them like they're cold cases. So as if nobody had ever been convicted of it. So our investigators and our students will basically just follow the evidence. Now, if the evidence leads back to the person who we are doing the investigation for, we say, we're sorry, we can't help, and we close the case. But as long as the investigation continues to point away from our client, we are likely to end up back into court on that case eventually, if we can find new evidence.
I want to ask you this question. On life without parole, do you think there should be more perimeters on that state law for life without parole?
I think life without parole is such a tricky sentencing option, because I think initially when it was passed as a alternative to life sentences in really serious murder cases. I think most people think it was passed as an alternative to a death sentence, but it wasn't. It was actually passed as an alternative to a life sentence, and during a time when people perceived that a life sentence only meant, I've heard jurors say they think a life sentence means 10 or 15 years. In Oklahoma, it means 40 years, but most people don't understand that. But yes, I mean, I think that in terms of sentencing, if you really want to have individualized, fair sentencing, which we should strive to have, I think, then I think there should be parameters on what differentiates a case that maybe a life sentence is appropriate versus a life without parole sentence, just like we differentiate what cases a death sentence is appropriate in. I don't know why that isn't a process for any sentence that requires somebody to go to prison for the rest of their life.
I, for one, having a whole different attitude about life without parole. I mean, executions today, when we find out how many people shouldn't be executed. And I never really realized. I said, well, they all had their chance. They've all been to court several different times. And so they've had a chance. But then I find out that I've learned a little bit, that I have learned in the last 10 years, is they don't have a chance. I mean, the DAs, basically, I'm not saying all DAs, absolutely not all DAs, but they'll not hold back evidence. And not bring all the evidence up.
Withholding evidence is a huge problem in capital context, and it's a huge problem in the wrongful conviction context. It's one of the leading factors of wrongful convictions around the world, really, but in the United States for sure. But what you just said touches on this misunderstanding of how the system works, because you often will hear somebody come out and say, this defendant has had appeal after appeal after appeal, and the courts have looked at all these issues. But the reality is, the courts don't look at issues on the merits of the issues once you get past direct appeal most of the time. So what I tell my students when I'm explaining how procedure works, the post-conviction process is like a pyramid. So trial is the base of the pyramid. This first level of appeal is kind of the second level of the pyramid. And then everything after that gets narrower and narrower. So the actual opportunity to have an appellate court review constitutional error, statutory error, it becomes narrower and narrower. So they don't really look at these issues over and over again. They might look at an issue one time, and they probably aren't even looking at all the issues one time. So it's very complicated, and it is a misnomer to say that courts consider issues over and over and over again, because they don't. They just don't.
Okay, I understand that now, but I did not understand that before. But I know that the problems is they do say, well, he's had a number of the trials. He's had a number of trials. They don't want to look at the issue, but the when you have somebody that's holding back evidence, they don't want to look bad. Now it comes up years later, they held evidence back and they don't want to look bad about it. But when we were trying on a case of a guy that's actually a friend of mine now, which the Pardon and Parole Board sent all the medical records along with it, how the stabbing occurred, what had happened, everything. They never got to that. They never read that a stabbing. But when you go to the Pardon and Parole Board, when you're trying to save a guy's life, they give you 3 minutes to stand up and make a
Right.
statement, and they don't have, actually the Pardon and Parole Board don't have enough people. I mean, they don't have enough people at all to make a decision on somebody's life.
And they probably don't have the time to really wade through the really complicated cases. I know they have a little bit more time to consider death sentences than they do just run of the mill. I mean, we file part of what we do is handle commutation requests and parole requests on behalf of our clients who we believe are innocent, but for whatever reason we don't think we haven't been successful in court. I will then take on the pardon and parole process. And I mean, it's just for the amount of time they can spend looking at cases. These aren't easy cases. And yeah, that amount of time makes it impossible to really be able to educate them on all of the facets and the complications in a case, especially in a wrongful conviction case. And in all fairness, the Pardon and Parole Board has mostly taken the position that I think that innocence isn't something they're worried about. What they're worried about is how an inmate has been since they've been incarcerated, if they have taken steps to improve themselves, if they've, taken advantage of programs and all of that stuff. So we don't really even get the opportunity to try to litigate innocence in front of the Pardon and Parole Board at all, well, which I would like to see changed. But
in this commutation hearing, they told us prior to the commutation hearing that we don't want to hear about, we want to try the case all over again. We don't want to hear about that. We don't know what he's done. What can he do? What he's got a job and everything. So we were all prepared to offer that he has a job offered to him. He has a car. He has a place to live. He has all this. But then they didn't want to hear this. They wanted to try the case all over again. So they told us they didn't want to. Then they changed their mind. They did want to do the case. It was very confusing system when we had to go back and try the case again, because in this particular case, it was a doctor could explain it, but a layman could not explain it the way the doctor could explain it. But they wouldn't let the doctor explain it.
And I'm familiar with the case you are referring to. And yes, I mean, it's a complicated explanation, and you certainly can't get into all of that either in what you can actually provide in a packet to the Pardon and Parole Board, let alone in the quick amount of time that you have to actually present your case. And then also, if the inmate is if it's a second stage proceeding, if the inmate's actually appearing, then it's very quick and it's very short. And I believe that the Pardon and Parole Board does an amazing job of getting through the sheer number of cases they do. I happen to agree with Representative Danny Williams that it should be a full-time job and not a part-time job, because I think it would lend itself to giving them more time to review these cases. But I don't have any complaints in terms of how hard the Pardon and Parole Board works. I think it's just too much for the there's too many requests for the amount of time they have to spend on those cases.
What do you think, JJ?
Bob, you told me to be quiet, so you hurt my feelings. I was really being quiet, but no. Here's what I think on the Pro Board. I agree with Danny Williams. I agree with Andrea that we need a couple of things changing. One, they don't have a substitute. So when one of them is sick, or when one of them has to recuse because they were involved in the case, or one of their family members are involved in the case, that leaves us with an unfair balance. So you're stacking the deck against that inmate trying to prove that he deserves this or that he is qualified for whatever thing. So one, there's a huge problem there that nobody wants to talk about. We filed a lawsuit. We knew that was going to happen in Richard Glossop's case. And we wrote beforehand and said, hey, you're going to have somebody recused, and that's going to put this unfair advantage. And they had a split decision, 2-2. And guess what? You've got to get 3-2 to win. So here's the deal. He's stuck, going to get executed because you have a person recused. So again, there's a lot of problems with that. I think they should be paid. I think we should take a lot of those cases that they're looking at and find alternative ways to release those people. I think that the pro board should just be looking at those cases that require a more, detailed, more in-depth look than just somebody coming up for a date that we can put out as an inmate in the community. And that way, if they violate, we can bring them right back in, and we can set a lot of parameters around them. So our whole system needs corrected. And we had a pretty good discussion. Andrea, you joined us there in an interim discussion about Richard Glossop. And one of the things that I was going to ask you is, how can the appellate court, when they're faced with so much evidence, overwhelming evidence of corruption, how do we see these courts go ahead and make obvious wrongful decisions unanimously? How does that happen?
Well, part of the way they've done it is through just the rules of the court. If you have, for example, and I think this is what you're specifically asking about, if you have a Brady claim, meaning you have a claim that the prosecution withheld exculpatory information, you have to bring in evidence to show something was withheld. I can't just say, they're not going to accept Andrea Miller at her word that the prosecution withheld evidence. You've got to bring the evidence forward. There is actually no court rule for the Court of Criminal Appeals that allows you to supplement a record with what's called extra record, meaning beyond what was introduced in court at the district court level, into an appeal. So you can't bring that evidence forward under the court rules on direct appeal. So even if you know about usually Brady material comes out years and years later, but even if you find it, I've had capital direct appeals where I tried to litigate a Brady claim and I was told there was no mechanism to bring it forward. And it's the same way with ineffective assistance of counsel claims, which is the other way. I mean, the other way to bring in information that you are alleging defense counsel should have followed up on, should have investigated, because defense counsel has an absolute duty to do an investigation also. Most people think that just falls on the prosecution, but defense attorneys are supposed to be conducting investigations too. The court rules around trying to supplement an ineffective assistance of trial counsel claim make it almost impossible also to supplement. So our court's done it just by court rules. You just can't do it. And then trying to get it into federal court is impossible at that point if you haven't been able to develop that record in the state.
We actually, in Richard Glossop's case, we called the AG the AG at the time and the district attorney over to an interim study and said, we want you to produce the evidence that we know you've withheld, because we knew they had withheld stuff.
Right.
And guess what? We couldn't get it. We couldn't get it in front of the court. They withheld it for years and years and years with us calling them out, you're withholding evidence, and it was crucial evidence. It was critical evidence. And so again, when this AG got involved in the case, he actually hired an investigator, and that investigator found that evidence and brought it forward. Otherwise, guess what? Even with us telling them what it was, telling them we know you're setting on this, they would not produce that, which is shameful on them because, again, they took an oath to justice, not to hide evidence, not to try to set some guy up. They took an oath to look at the entire case and let the evidence drive the case where it goes, not destroy. In that case, they were actually caught destroying evidence, Have you ever seen where a prosecutor has been prosecuted for that kind of conduct?
Well, I was involved in a capital murder case where my client was exonerated from death row, where the prosecutor was caught hiding evidence and making up evidence, and he was ultimately sanctioned by the Oklahoma Supreme Court for a 6-month suspension. And the only reason why it was a 6-month suspension was because the court reasoned that everybody in that office was doing the same thing. So how could he have known to do any better? And that is a published opinion from the Oklahoma Supreme Court. But JJ, I want to make a point about what you just said. So think about this. You are a legislator, and you could not force the state's hand to disclose information that by law and ethics they're required to disclose. So imagine how somebody sitting in a prison cell trying to litigate these claims on their own without the help of counsel does it. They can't. So they will raise it, and because they don't get appointed counsel, they don't get investigators appointed, and the state courts rarely order prosecutors to turn over information in post-conviction. It is impossible under those circumstances, which is why it's so critically important that people get help trying to do that.
Let me ask you, have you noticed how much worse it used to when I worked in there? If an attorney wanted to see their client, or if they had a new client, or if an investigator wanted to see somebody, they just went in there and said, hey, I'm ex-investigator. Here's my credentials. I need to talk to this guy because he may be a witness in this case. Now they're saying, nope, unless he's asked to talk to you, you can't. And how do you get the information to get the guy to talk to you? And then even if you are an attorney, I'm working with 2 or 3 attorneys that, hey, they show up, nope, you can't get in there today, or you were rude, you can't go in, just every excuse you can imagine to keep attorneys from getting in to speak to their client. Have you noticed that getting worse over the years? I'd say it's at an all-time high right now.
I think scheduling visits has gotten worse. To schedule client visits, I think a lot of that has to do with the reduction of staff within the facilities itself, and just trying to manage all the visits and everything. I have found in recent years, it has become much harder for us to get access to interview witnesses. So to set up a visit for somebody who isn't our client, who is somebody who's a material witness in the case that we need to talk to. That part has definitely gotten worse, to the point that we still try, but most of the time it's not effective unless we write ahead of time and they write us back and say they're willing to visit with us, which, depending on the case, isn't necessarily the best process for the investigation. But yeah, the attorney visits and of course county jails are, I think, far worse than DOC, even on actually being able to get the circumstances around actually getting to visit a client and actually being able to get in at reasonable times to visit clients. Again, which might again be attributed to a reduction in just available personnel. I mean, I like everybody who's represented clients in Oklahoma County. I mean, I've been stuck in the Oklahoma County jail for hours, first trying to see a client, and then because I can't get anybody to come take me back downstairs afterwards. So yeah, it's definitely an ongoing problem, and it certainly interferes with the attorney-client relationship.
Now you teach at OCU, correct?
I do.
And exactly what is it called?
So the Oklahoma Innocence Project is actually a law clinic. So what that means is students get credit for working with me on cases. So there's a classroom component to the clinic, and we have 2 hours of class every week, and then they have to do a certain number of field hours. And the field hours is the actual hands-on work on a case. So either they are reviewing files, trying to help us get records. Sometimes getting records is very difficult because we are relegated to using Open Records Act requests a lot of the time, and that comes with its own. They become very well versed in Open Records requests. When we get further down the line, they work with our investigators, so they might actually have the opportunity to go interview witnesses, go visit a crime scene if the crime scene still exists, kind of learn the hands-on part of doing that investigation. And then farther down the line, they might help me with drafting pleadings to actually get a case back into court. In order to come into the clinic, I also teach a prerequisite class called wrongful convictions, where they learn the basics of post-conviction procedure and federal habeas procedure, which is everybody's least favorite 3 weeks of law school ever. I think it's awful to teach. It's awful for them to have to sit through. But then we get to the fun stuff. We get to the interesting actual substantive causes of wrongful convictions, like faulty forensic evidence and false confessions, bad eyewitness identification evidence, ineffective assistance of counsel, Brady violations, prosecutorial misconduct. That's where they learn all that stuff. So they get the basics of the sort of legal issues we're looking for. Because in order to get back into court, we have to have new evidence, meaning evidence that nobody's ever presented before. But then we also have to have constitutional error. We have to be able to show both in order to get relief. So the students are really having to learn how to do both sides of that kind of investigation.
Hey, let me back you up for a second. I want to ask a legal question.
Okay.
You were talking about open records a while ago. So if let's say if a director of the Department of Corrections was found to be guilty of violating open records, is he subject to jail? Is he 6 months jail, 1 year jail? I mean, is he subject? Possibility.
So this is where I have to profess that I don't actually know the answer to that question. I don't think so. I think the Department of Corrections would be subject to a civil lawsuit where they have to produce the materials and then maybe have to pay for the cost of the reproduction of the materials themselves and have to pay attorney's fees for the litigation. But I do not believe that it is punishable by, now it might be at the point that a court orders documents to be turned over. If they are not turned over, at that point, potentially there could be a contempt charge because they're not complying with a lawful court order.
What if they come out and openly say we're going to violate it and we don't care, and they do that before the court orders it? So what if you have a document that says, hey, you're not getting, to a legislator, you're not getting records, and we have an agreement with your own house leadership, you're not getting records, and you'll have to come over to our headquarters and view it, and you'll have to sign a non-disclosure. Now, an elected official has to sign a non-disclosure to, we're going to get legal advice for it. You aren't charging. You said pro bono, didn't you? So
I don't think you want my advice on this issue.
well,
for the record, I am not qualified to answer anything beyond what I just answered.
Well,
but no, I don't think it carries criminal punishment for failure.
Well, that's disappointing. Hey, Director, that may be some good news. I'm going to follow up and I'm going to make sure, I'm going to try to make sure that she's wrong on that. Try to put your butt in jail. That's what I'm trying to do. You deserve to go to jail, Director. I just want to tell you that. So I like to talk to the director because I know he watches this. I know he watches it, and I like to tell him when he does criminal stuff that we're going to try to put him in jail. So I like to always advise him of his. You have the right to remain silent. Remember that, Director, when they come pick you up.
Well, how long have you been with the Innocent Project?
I have been here as legal director since 2019, but I've been teaching at OCU Law School since 2009 and started teaching the prerequisite class in 2011 when the project first opened. So I've been involved in the project since its opening. I just didn't become official until 2019.
Okay. So tell us about some of the cases that you've uncovered.
Well, our most recent full exoneration was a case out of Sequoyah County where our client was convicted of a first-degree murder that he did not commit. It was a cold case. The homicide actually occurred in 1997. He was not charged. My client was not charged until 2014. The charge came based on the false confession of a co-defendant, coerced confession of a co-defendant, and the word of an informant who was a very well-known informant in the county where my client was charged. But my client had an attorney from a different part of the state who was unaware of this man's history, and the state failed to disclose his informant history. And when I say informant history, I mean long informant history. And we broke the case open. My investigator, Bobby Staten, who's a great investigator, figured out that the informant had said that my client had come to his house after beating a man to death, covered in blood, had taken a shower, burned his clothes, and then left. And he gave the address of the house where my client was alleged to have come from. And my investigator found out that the informant did not live in that house the day of the homicide, that he had moved out like 6 months before. But since there was so much time between the homicide and when he was talking to authorities about the case and giving this information to him, I guess he'd forgotten that he didn't live at that house anymore. And so that's kind of what broke the case open. He was caught lying. Trial counsel didn't do that investigation, and didn't realize that he didn't live in the house at the time. So, note to defense counsel, check utility records. And so, so that resulted in a full exoneration. Our client served 10 years for that crime that he did not commit.
Did they get the guy who did commit the crime?
No, we suggested there were some items to DNA tests that we thought could have been helpful in identifying the actual perpetrator. I don't think that the state followed up to do that. The person who we think, I make a point of saying we don't have to prove who did it. We just have to prove who didn't do it.
Right.
But the person who we think did it is no longer alive. And so there wasn't a lot of interest, a lot of appetite to continue investigating the case, since we think the actual perpetrator had already passed away and actually passed away within a month or two of the homicide, under circumstances that maybe looked like it was a sense of, I don't want to go to prison for this. So there was some behavior on the part of that person that looks like it could be consciousness of guilt sort of evidence.
Over the years, have you seen a change in the investigations, a bit more, more specific, or they can get more information now than they could, say, 10 years ago?
On our end, or on law enforcement's end?
On your end.
I think that in this project, I think we have become better at this over the years. I think, I learned something new on every case. And it's so funny because I've been practicing law for 20 more years than I want to say. And I think that I'm at the point where nothing's going to surprise me. And every single case we have, there's something that surprises me. And we learn, like the case I was just talking about. Now I know that maybe we need to be checking utility records every time somebody says, I was at this house on this date when this happened, to see if it's actually true or not. So we have gotten better. We've gotten more sophisticated about what we're doing in investigating wrongful convictions. It's a little bit different on this end of things than it is, say, preparing a case for trial, where our investigation can take a much broader view. Because after years, usually if new evidence is going to surface, it's going to surface after years. It's not going to surface while somebody's waiting to be tried. And it's not going to usually surface immediately afterwards. But yes, and then we also have the benefit of, better forensic technology out there, where sometimes somebody might have been convicted based on a faulty forensic theory that can now be discredited. I forgot to mention that along the lines of forensic evidence, we work with a collaboration with the Forensic Science Institute at the University of Central Oklahoma. So we actually have forensic graduate students in the clinic working on teams with our law students, which is a game changer in terms of being able to dissect whatever forensic evidence or scientific evidence was admitted at trial to determine if there's something wrong with it or not.
What about DNA? has there been some changes in being more accurate today than what
Yeah,
was
oh
10
yes.
years ago?
Yeah. Oh, yes. And I have no doubt that 10 years from now, I'm going to be looking back saying, we thought we really had it right in 2025, but now we get it. Now, DNA there's been a lot of developments in the last 10 years. One is that they now test on 24 places on the genetic chain. It used to be 13. So it gives you a much more individualized um, snapshot of whose genetic material it likely is. They can't ever say it's a match, but they can say this person is included or excluded, and then give probability statistics as to the likelihood of that. It takes a much smaller quantity of DNA to test than it used to. This 1993 rape case I have out of Muskogee, where our client where we've just obtained exculpatory evidence, but we're waiting for the evidentiary hearing. At the time that his original case was investigated, it took a quantity of DNA around the size of a quarter to do any rudimentary DNA testing. Now they can test just unbelievably small quantity. I mean, everybody's heard of contact DNA and touch DNA, where they can actually get DNA just from contact sometimes. And there's new technologies that are now helping them collect that sort of DNA, even on old cases. So the progress that's been made in DNA cases is unbelievable. And we're fortunate because we have a separate post-conviction DNA testing statute. So sometimes when somebody can no longer get back into court because they've already litigated all their issues, if there's DNA to be tested, they can still at least get back into court to ask for DNA testing.
Well, I know that. I mean, I just know what I've read, that it's more accurate today than what it's ever been. And it's probably going to even get more accurate, I guess, like you say, than it's ever been. But how do you handle it as the students graduate? Each year you got students graduating. How does that work out?
What that works out as is I inherit all of their cases. And so we're constantly, it takes forever. An exoneration takes on average 10 years from start to finish. I mean, it's a long process. We've got a case out of Osage County. I'm working on the petition now that we've been investigating since 2018. I mean, those students are seasoned lawyers. The students who started that case are seasoned lawyers now. So they go on and they graduate and they pass the bar and they become lawyers. And I just accumulate all of the cases. And so my cases the numbers get bigger and bigger every semester as they move on. I've actually had a couple of cases where students have stayed on and become my co-counsel. And that's always a fun experience because they stay local and they want to stay involved. And so that's
fun. Get the fever. And they want to keep going.
Yeah. We fortunately have just hired a new staff attorney who will now be dividing the accumulation of cases with me as we move forward, which is nice for me.
Hey, I want to ask you something. You said you'd been going to represent clients for 20 plus years. So have you been going into the prisons for that long? Have you
Yes.
actually went in?
Yes, because I've always done appellate and post-conviction stuff. So my clients have always been incarcerated.
Well, have you noticed the decline? I mean, are you getting reports? Because you're going in there and talking to actual people.
Right.
And I don't know if you talk to the staff as well. I figure, you get used to going in there, they get to know you, and you kind of build a relationship with them, and they learn you're an attorney, and so they'll, maybe confide in you and stuff that they might not confide in other people. But have you noticed how bad, I mean, in your opinion, has the prisons went on a super downhill, but we're at the lowest place? Would you not agree? As far as food and we're just talking basic principle things, people getting raped and people getting threatened and extorted. And are you witnessing that? Because you're an outside. This is the first time I haven't set you up previously with this question. Right. I am asking you. You're an outside objective, because I get accused of being non-objective. Imagine that. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
let's hear an objective party that goes in. Has that been your experience?
I think it ebbs and flows, but yes, I think in recent years, the facilities themselves have, I think physically the facilities, some of them are not in very good shape. I do think the food quality remains a challenge in a lot of the facilities, and it depends on what facility you're talking about. I mean, there are some facilities that seem to run better than others, seem to be better staffed than others, probably has to do with location, I would imagine. But yes, I mean, I think that you can kind of tell from my perspective. Now, of course, they don't take me when you go visit a client, when you're an attorney and you go visit a client, they're not parading you around the entire prison. You're only seeing a little tiny bit from where you check in to go in to wherever the visitation is. So I'm not necessarily getting a view, although I not too long ago had to visit somebody who was in the very back of Lawton Correctional Facility, for example. So I saw more of the facility itself on that visit because I had to go all the way to the back of the facility, whereas normally I'm visiting in the closest building in that facility. And yes, I mean, I think there's been a decline. I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of personnel who are working there, because I really do think that most of the people I have encountered over the years who work for DOC are doing their best to do their job. Now, that's not true of everybody, and there are problems with some personnel. I'm not saying that's not true, and I'm not saying they all treat my clients well. But what I'm saying is most of the people who are working for DOC are just showing up and trying to do their jobs. And it's hard to do their jobs because there's not enough of them. And I think that the lack of personnel within DOC is a problem. I think that, it's expensive to run a prison system as large as our prison system. And the buildings aren't in great shape. And I think that takes a lot of toll on inmates. And yes, and then of course there's the problem with the violence. And I've seen the recent numbers. I find them hard to believe based on my experience and what I hear from the inside. But there is a lot of violence within the walls, for sure.
On the
I don't know if
innocent,
that answered your question or not, but that's my observation.
on the Innocent Project, we have one in every state, but they're not connected. You're just loosely connected. You work together, but you're not connected. Is that correct?
That's correct. So, and not quite every state. Most states have one. Some states have multiple projects, and then you have some states, and this is something that I wish Oklahoma would look at, given the sheer number of wrongful convictions we've had over the years, who actually have commissions that are established by the legislature to go in and investigate cases. So North Carolina and Texas both have kind of that sort of system where there is an Innocence Project at Duke University, but there's also the North Carolina Innocence Commission that is a government-funded program to sort through cases and work on cases of wrongful convictions, both of which were the direct result of very high-profile wrongful convictions in those two states. So I wish we could follow suit. I mean, Texas has gone beyond that. Texas has the Texas Forensic Science Commission that studies forensic science. And I mean, they've done all sorts of stuff around the problem of wrongful convictions. But there is a project in most states at this point. It's actually an international network. So there are projects around the world. There's one in Hong Kong. There's one in Amsterdam. There's one in Mexico. There's some in South America. So they're actually springing up around the world. I mean, this is an international problem. This isn't a problem that is unique to the United States. But when I say we are loosely affiliated, what that means is we're all responsible for how we run, what kind of cases we work on. Because, for example, the Innocence Project in New York does nothing but DNA. They do DNA all over the country, but it's just DNA cases. We are limited to cases out of Oklahoma, but we take any kind of case, DNA cases, non-DNA cases. We'll look at anything if somebody's claiming they're innocent. Whether there's a path to exonerate them or not is a whole nother question. But so we're all responsible for our own criteria and how our projects work. And we're all responsible for our own fundraising, which is a challenge that everybody faces because these are very expensive cases to litigate. I mean, it costs far more money to get an innocent person out of prison than it takes to get them there in the first place. And so fundraising is constantly an issue for us. But we are part of a network that gives us access to each other. It gives us access to training. It gives us access sometimes to experts who are willing to work on wrongful conviction cases for free, since we're working for free. And so it opens some doors that we might not otherwise have. And we share information, which is good. I mean, I'm not a big data person, but there are big data people within our network, which is helpful for me when I need to say, well, there's been 5 cases that under these circumstances have generated, exculpatory evidence or whatever. So it's helpful to be a part of a network rather than just to be a standalone by ourselves entity.
Has anybody kept any records of wrongful convictions?
Yes, there is a great resource called the National Registry of Exonerations that is maintained by the University of Michigan School of Law. They are actually the repository for all information relating to every case in the United States and maybe internationally where there has been an actual exoneration. So when we win a case, when we get an exoneration, they will reach out to us and they will actually obtain tons of information about the case. They'll get the pleadings and, get details they need about the case. And that way anybody, and it's a public facing database that anybody can go in and you can research cases that have specific causes of wrongful conviction. So if you've got a bad eyewitness identification case, for example, and you want to see how many times that's happened in the United States in wrongful conviction cases, you can go to that database and generate those numbers yourself.
Do you know how Oklahoma comes in line with wrongful convictions?
Well, it used to be, actually, there was a time where we were leading per capita in wrongful convictions. We've been surpassed now because other states have adopted reforms that help innocent people get themselves exonerated. So the numbers have gone up in the states where they have improved those paths to innocence. But we're pretty high up there, I think. I can't, off the top of my head, I don't know what we are per capita, but it's within the top 10, I think. And that's all on there. And then we've had cases of mass exonerations where, something inherent in a law enforcement agency results, corruption or whatever, resulted in multiple people being wrongfully convicted for a crime. And so we've had that, of course, bolsters our numbers a little bit, although those numbers are a little harder to come by because it's not always clear how many cases those issues impact.
Do you have a question there, JJ?
No, Bob, I'm just listening to you guys.
Well, it's not any fun, JJ, when you don't get involved.
I'm listening, Bob. We're talking about wrongful convictions. I just laugh because, man, I've been up here fighting the entire system. When you're talking about, DA supervision, you want to talk about wrongful. I mean, hey, the DAs filed a lawsuit in which they filed directly to the appellate court. The appellate court tells the DAs, you cannot use the money for anything but supervision. It must be used for supervision. Okay. Then we turn around and see they file probation. So they basically, the district attorneys blow up probation. So all of our community supervision has been blown apart by the DAs. We have none in Oklahoma. What we did have has been ruined by the DAs on a fraudulent, so they fraudulently put people on. They put themselves in a plea. It's so wrong it can't even hardly be. So here's the district attorney going to decide, should I charge you? They're going to make money out of charging you. That's messed up. Then they put themselves into a plea. That's messed up. Then they put themselves over supervision. And then guess who decides if you violate your supervision, which generally the only violation is if you don't pay them their money. That's the violations. You can go out and kill the Pope. That's all right. But if you don't pay the money, we're going to send you. So if you want to talk about a massive, fraud on the entire state, a massive wrongful conviction, I think we can go back for the last 12 years and we could say, man, Oklahoma's the worst. I just got off hey, director, just want to let you know, I got off CBS talking about you. And if you got some DA friends, I was talking about them. You may want to call your DA friends since you have everybody in your hip pocket, you say. So go ahead and call your DA friends and you and them get together because you may need some supervision before it's all said and done. Maybe they'll give you one of them probation cases where all you got to do is pay $40 or so. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested. I can talk on the subject all day long, but I was letting y'all visit. So,
well, JJ, what you're talking about actually figures in with our cases and I'm going to channel my former boss, Bob Ravitz from the Public Defender's Office when I say this. If you have a system where they have a vested interest in getting convictions, whether it's because they're getting fees from those convictions or because, they win enough cases, they can make a name for themselves and keep running for office or whatever it is, they have a vested interest. So the problem is you got to take the financial incentive out of it, I think. Absolutely. And probably the whole system becomes fair. I don't know how you do that, though, because it's an expensive system.
Well, you have legislators pay for the system. That's what we should be doing. And then we find the fraud, waste, and all that you see. I mean, again, how many DA investigators? DA investigators should be DA investigators. They should be doing the investigations like you have to have investigators. DAs need investigators to look in. Is this information right? Is the information not right? So they can do a better job. I think we should pay that. But what they don't need to be is involved in check collecting. That was the biggest scam I have ever seen. You want to talk about crooks? The people who's taken oath to be the top people in the state are the biggest damn crooks you ever seen in your life, with the check writing scams, with the fraud on probation, with taking away everything and controlling the whole system. Guess what? You don't need defense attorneys. I'm surprised we got any defense attorneys. Maybe a murder case or two, but most cases anymore, walk into court, they go, we'll give you DA probation for that. Tomorrow you walk back in, they don't revoke you. We'll give you another one. You pay us double. Oh, third one. Oh, you can pay us triple. Guess what? 4 more. Oh, hey, no problem. We go all day long. And that's what you're seeing. No supervision, no accountability, no holding or changing behavior or holding accountable to offenders, which is not good for offenders, not good for the community, not good for anything. And again, that's a system we're seeing. That's what I ran on. That's what I came to town on. And then if you would have told me, I work for the Department of Corrections, but if you would have told me the fraud, the abuse, all the stuff that I see in the Department of Corrections, I could get fired up. I could say a whole lot, Bob. I could get fired up, get on my stand. But again, I think people need to hear. I think people working in the department need to hear what Andrea is saying, because I worked in the department, and if you'd have told me the numbers, and since I've gotten to know, Andrea and have listened to her at her interims, and we went out and ate, and we've talked, and again, I just get more information. But if you'd have told me that many people are innocent, 1,000, more than 1,000 people doing time today are very, very likely innocent. Can you imagine what it would be like today to go into our prison system today, which is, man, if you weren't messed up when you went into our system, you'd damn sure be messed up when you come out.
And we have, our clients require a lot of aftercare because of that, because they all come out. Because a lot of them, some of them had some criminal history, but a lot of our clients had no criminal history before they went in for, a life sentence. And yeah, it's hard. I mean, it sounds like, people get out and they get all this money and their life is great. And that's not usually how it goes. And it's a hard existence.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Normally you don't just get hey, you're innocent and you're out the door. Normally you're going to get we're going to let you go out the door because we found some problem. But you can't turn around and sue because they're going to tell you you're going to have to agree to this to get out. So guess what? 90% of your cases, you're just glad to get out of prison.
That's right. In a lot of cases. Now, that's not always the case. I mean, the case I was referring to from Sequoia County, he did fully get exonerated, and it does happen. But, you know, there's also a moment where sometimes somebody has to make a decision. Do I get out of prison today, or do I keep fighting for the next 10 years with no guarantee that I'm going to get out? And most of us, I think, would take the I'm going to get out right now and not keep fighting it, because winning in court is very difficult. I mean, I spend a semester explaining to students how hard it is, and I won't go into it all now in our last couple of minutes, but yeah, it's hard, and that's a decision a lot of people have to make. And that,
when you walk into a courtroom and Orange is wearing shackles, it's hard for them to get no, this guy's innocent in there.
Right.
And again, we were in legislation. We were in voting the other day on a bill, and it was, should the amount that they can sue for be increased? And we were talking about that it was like 55,000 or so per year. And my deal was, how many of y'all go to prison for 55,000? Right. No, I wouldn't go to prison for 55,000. You know,
and I think Representative Jewell made that point nicely when he said there's not enough money in the world to go to prison for falsely for 30 years.
Gosh.
Yes, yeah. And the Oklahoma Innocence Project is very in favor of changing the way we compensate people who get out after being wrongfully convicted. It's a great opportunity to give them something more than even just the money, because it comes with other benefits, like health benefits that are a struggle. You know, right. you can imagine how much the world changes in 20 or 30 years, and you get out and you don't have any money. You don't.
Bob's been out and he can't even get his phone to work half the time. You know? So
we appreciate you coming on with us today, and JJ, thank you again for your input.
Hey Bob, I want to say I was very quiet today. You know,
well, I didn't mean to say. Be real quiet like you was. You scared me. You know that I was afraid you'd fall asleep over there.
No, I left him speechless.
Well, I honestly do. I think that Andrea needs to be heard on. We're not having her on. She needs to get heard. People need to hear how many people are wrongfully convicted. It's a big deal.
Well, thank you.
By the way, that brings up a question. Is it Audrey or Andrea? What is your name?
It's Andrea. At least when I'm in Oklahoma, I went to undergrad out east, and it was Andrea or Andrea, but no, it's Andrea.
Well,
we can all use our twang.
Hopefully we can get together on the 7th and have some good news. And we thank you so much. I think you've been very informative for us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
See you guys.
Bye.